The words hit the air before I even had time to process them. My brother Marcus stood at the center of my uncle's backyard, glass raised, surrounded by his clients, his colleagues, his carefully curated audience, and he pointed at me with that grin I had known my entire life. The one that meant he was about to say something cruel dressed up as comedy, and he said it clearly, loudly, proudly. This is the biggest mistake in our family. The laughter that followed wasn't polite. It was genuine, warm even, like he had delivered a punchline everyone had been waiting for. Someone clapped. A few people clinked their glasses together like it was a toast worth celebrating. My mother, sitting 3 seats down from me, smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncomfortable smile. A satisfied one. The kind that says, yes, that's right, keep going. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I am the younger sister. The quiet one, the one they stopped paying attention to once I stopped being loud about my own existence. I had spent the better part of my adult life being the background character in a story my family had already decided Marcus would star in. I was the footnote, the afterthought, the mistake. That's what tonight was supposed to confirm, surrounded by his success, his guests, his moment. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been sitting at that table for over an hour watching one of my most important professional contacts try very hard not to look confused about what he was witnessing. The man in the charcoal suit near the drink table had gone very still. He wasn't laughing. He was watching me the way people watch something they're trying to understand. And in that moment, I understood something too. The night wasn't going to end the way Marcus had planned. Growing up, Marcus was the sun, and the rest of us were expected to orbit him without complaint. My mother had decided early on that he had something special, that rare combination of confidence and charisma that made adults take notice, that made rooms shift when he walked in. She wasn't wrong about that. Marcus did have presence. He had charm. What she missed, or chose not to see, was that charm without character is just performance, and Marcus had been performing his whole life without ever being asked to show what was underneath. When he failed a class, it was the teacher's fault. When he lost a contract, it was bad luck. When he hurt someone's feelings, it was just his sense of humor. The world bent around Marcus because my mother allowed it to, and in that bending, there was always collateral. That collateral was usually me. I learned to be invisible because visibility cost too much. Every time I raised my hand, every time I tried to correct the narrative, it ended with me being told I was too sensitive, too serious, too much. So I became less. I got quieter. I stopped correcting people when they got my accomplishments wrong or erased them entirely. After college, while Marcus was launching his consulting firm with my mother cheerleading from the sidelines, I was being hired by one of the most selective private investment firms in the country. Horizon Equity doesn't advertise. They don't post on social media. They don't put their name on buildings. They move quietly and they move precisely, and they had decided, after a very long vetting process, that I was exactly the kind of person they needed. The NDAs I signed weren't just paperwork. They were a way of life. No LinkedIn announcements. No family dinners where I casually dropped what I did for a living. I signed those papers and I breathed for the first time in years because finally, my success belonged to me and only me. Nobody could take credit for it. Nobody could diminish it with a well-timed joke. It existed in a space my family couldn't reach. That peace was worth more than any recognition they could have offered. But peace, I've come to understand, is not the same as healing. I could protect my work from them. I couldn't protect my heart from sitting in that backyard listening to my brother call me a mistake while my mother smiled like he'd said something wise. The man in the charcoal suit's name was Daniel Reeves. He was a senior partner at a firm we had recently entered into a significant agreement with, and he had come to this party because Marcus had invited him, had spent weeks cultivating that relationship, had talked about this evening like it was going to be the moment everything clicked into place professionally. Marcus had no idea that Daniel and I had worked together for the better part of 18 months. Our communication was strictly professional, strictly private, and strictly bound by agreements that neither of us would violate. But Daniel knew who I was. He knew exactly who I was. And watching Marcus point at his sister and call her the biggest mistake in the family, while that sister happened to be the director of strategic acquisitions at the firm that owned 51% of Marcus's company. Daniel Reeves had clearly decided that staying quiet was no longer something he was able to do. Marcus was still working the crowd. He loved this part. He loved the momentum of a room behind him, loved feeling the energy build, loved knowing that people were leaning in. He looked at me with that particular expression he had perfected over decades, fond but condescending, the way you might look at a dog who keeps trying to sit at the dinner table. Some people, he said, swirling his glass, just aren't built for the bigger game. More laughter. A few uncomfortable glances from people who didn't know us well enough to decide whether this was affectionate or something else. My mother reached over and touched my arm. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a reminder. Stay in your lane. Stay small. This is his night. I felt it move through me, that old familiar compression, the feeling of making myself fit into a space that had never actually been designed for me. And then Daniel stood up. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't raise his hand. He simply stood, and the quality of the air in that backyard changed instantly. People who had been laughing went quiet without knowing why. Marcus turned toward him with the open smile of a man who thinks the attention is about to go his way. Daniel looked at Marcus with an expression that was almost clinical. Before the toast, he said evenly, "I want to make sure I'm understanding something correctly. You just called Evelyn the biggest mistake in your family." Marcus laughed, leaning into it. "Sibling stuff, you know how it is." Daniel nodded slowly, like he was processing information that didn't quite add up. Then he looked at me. "Evelyn Carter," he said, and his voice was calm and clear enough that every single person at that table heard every single word. "Director of Strategic Acquisitions. Horizon Equity." The backyard went silent in a way that felt physical, like the sound had been removed from the air entirely. I watched my mother's face do something I had never seen it do before. It emptied. Marcus's confidence didn't just falter, it vanished. In the span of 2 seconds, the smug certainty that had lived on his face for 36 years was simply gone, and what replaced it was something rawer and smaller, and, if I'm being honest with myself, something I had not entirely prepared myself to witness. Daniel wasn't finished. "The firm," he continued in that same measured tone, "that holds the majority stake in your company. That approved your last 2 expansions. That you have been trying to impress all evening." Someone at the far end of the table set down a fork, and the sound of it hitting the plate was extraordinarily loud. My mother turned to me, and she said my name, just my name, in a whisper, and it sounded less like she was speaking to me and more like she was trying to undo something. Marcus opened his mouth. I watched him search for words the way you watch someone search for a life jacket after the boat has already gone under. Nothing came. I stood up. I didn't rush. That was the thing nobody expected. They were all waiting for anger, for tears, for the kind of dramatic collapse that would have made Marcus feel justified in his cruelty, would have confirmed everything he had always said about me being too emotional, too fragile, too much. Instead, I stood in that backyard under those string lights with dessert plates still half full on the table, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in this moment. I felt calm. Not the performed calm of someone holding themselves together by sheer force of will, but something deeper and quieter, the calm of a person who has already done the hard work and is simply watching the results arrive. I had imagined versions of this moment for years. Quieter versions, private versions, versions where I simply stopped showing up to family events and let the distance speak for itself. I had never imagined it would happen like this, with an audience, with a professional witness, with my brother's own ambition as the stage. But here we were. I looked at Marcus first, because that felt right, because he had started this, and he deserved to be the first person I addressed. I didn't hide who I was, I said, and I kept my voice gentle because gentleness in that moment was more devastating than anger ever could have been. I just didn't announce it. He was still searching for the right expression, trying to locate the version of himself that could navigate this. The charming Marcus, the quick-witted Marcus, the Marcus who always had a comeback ready. That Marcus had apparently left the party. The one standing in front of me now looked younger than I had ever seen him. almost like the brother I remembered from before the world taught him that he was exceptional and everyone else was background. He swallowed and said my name, and then said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I noticed the us, the sudden shift from I to us, the way people reach for family language when they need a shield. I looked at my mother when he said that. She was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes somewhere slightly to the left of my face, unable to land directly on me. That hurt in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Not the sharp hurt of a new wound, but the dull, heavy hurt of an old one being confirmed. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't proud. She was calculating. I could see it happening behind her eyes, this rapid, quiet reassessment of how the evening had gone wrong and whether there was still a way to recover the narrative. I said that I had signed confidentiality agreements and that, honestly, no one had ever asked. That second part was the truest thing I said all evening, and I watched it land on her specifically because she was the one who should have asked. Not about my job title or my salary or my professional accomplishments. Just about me. Just whether I was okay, whether I was happy, whether the quiet had been chosen or endured. She never asked because she had already decided the answer, and the answer was that Evelyn was fine, Evelyn was manageable, Evelyn didn't need much. Daniel had stepped back in that way that people with real authority move, giving space not because they're done, but because they understand that the most important moments don't need supervision. I told them I wasn't there to embarrass anyone. I meant that. What happened next wasn't designed to humiliate Marcus in front of his clients. It wasn't a performance I had staged for maximum impact. It was simply a decision I had made weeks earlier when I sat in a quiet office reviewing his company's structure and understood, professionally and without emotion, that changes needed to happen. The timing was coincidental in the way that all timing eventually is when you have been patient long enough. Marcus laughed then, the weak version, the version that's really just a sound a person makes when they can't think of anything else. He said, "Okay, let's not make this a thing," and he said it with that familiar dismissive wave of his hand, the gesture that had ended so many conversations over so many years. The one that meant your feelings are inconvenient to me right now, so I need you to put them away. I smiled at him. I said, "Oh, I already did." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I had been expecting it. I had known it was coming the same way you know the sun is going to rise, not because you can see it yet, but because you understand how things work. I let it buzz a second time before I stepped away from the table, because some moments deserve a breath of space before they change everything permanently. Marcus watched me walk away from the table. I could feel his eyes following me, could hear the shift in the ambient noise of the backyard, the whispered questions, the guests who were clients suddenly looking at each other trying to piece together what they had missed and how long they had been missing it. I answered the call and said yes, quietly, and then said, "You have my approval," and hung up. When I turned back, Marcus was already on his feet. The man who had spent an entire evening performing confidence for a room full of people was now standing with his hands slightly open at his sides, a posture I recognized as barely contained panic trying to look like composure. He asked what the approval was for, and I told him it was for the restructure effective Monday, and I watched those words move through him the way cold water moves through a system that wasn't prepared for it. He said, "You can't just," and then he said, "This is my company," and his voice had risen half a pitch without him realizing it, and I tilted my head slightly and said, "No, it's the company you run." And I explained the difference the way you explain something to someone you genuinely want to understand it rather than someone you want to defeat. I told him about the vendor consolidation, about the leadership review, about the shift toward measurable performance over personality. My mother said, "Sweetheart, you don't have to do this," and there was a plea in it, but also something else, a last attempt to remind me of the role I was supposed to be playing in this family, the accommodating one, the one who absorbs without complaint and makes peace at her own expense. I looked at her for a long moment. I said I do, because this isn't punishment. It's correction. And I meant that in every sense of the word. Marcus followed me toward the driveway when I started to leave. His voice had dropped into something private and urgent, stripped of the performance he'd been maintaining all evening. He said we're family, and the way he said it made clear he understood exactly how hollow it sounded after what he had just spent an hour doing in front of an audience. I stopped and turned to face him in the dim light away from the string lights and the guests and the careful social architecture he had built. I said no, I said you revealed yourself in front of everyone. I just didn't protect you from it. He said I was going to ruin him, and I shook my head and told him I wasn't ruining him. I was simply removing my hands from a wheel he had never properly learned to drive. Behind us, I could hear my mother crying. That sound had controlled me for so long, had been the alarm that sent me running back to smallness every time I got close to standing up fully. That night it didn't move me the way it used to, and I won't pretend that didn't cost me something, because it did. It cost me the version of myself that still believed if I was just patient enough, just quiet enough, just good enough, the love I needed from my family would eventually show up in a form I could actually receive. Marcus's voice broke when he said I could have warned him, and I met his eyes and I said, and you could have respected me, and there was nothing left after that. No comeback, no charm, no redirect. Just a man standing in a driveway understanding for the first time that the people we dismiss don't disappear. They simply move beyond our reach. Monday morning came with the kind of clarity that follows long overdue decisions. I sat in a glass conference room with city traffic moving below me and a cup of coffee I kept forgetting to drink. Marcus's resignation arrived at 8 a.m, brief and defensive, and signed with a title he would not hold by end of business. The board accepted it without sentiment because boards don't run on sentiment, they run on stability, and stability had a new face now. My mother called before noon. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. She asked if it was worth it, and I closed my eyes for a moment before I answered because that question deserved honesty rather than strategy. I told her I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it to stop shrinking. She was quiet for longer than I expected, and then she said softer than I had heard her speak to me in years, I didn't know you were that powerful, and I felt something move through me that was equal parts grief and relief. I told her that was the problem. The next family gathering, my chair was still at the table. So was Marcus's. But the air in the room had changed permanently, the way air changes after a storm has moved through, cleaner somehow, but also carrying the memory of what the pressure had been before. Nobody called me a mistake. Nobody called me anything small. Not because they feared me, though perhaps some of them did now, but because the truth had finally taken up enough space in that room that there was nowhere left for the old story to stand. Daniel nodded to me from across the room that evening, a nod that carried the particular weight of professional respect between two people who have witnessed something significant together. My mother watched me from the kitchen doorway, and I watched her back, and between us was everything that had been said and everything that probably never would be, and the particular exhaustion of loving someone who sees you clearly only when there is no other choice. Marcus sat at the end of the table looking like a man relearning the shape of a room he thought he knew. I didn't feel triumphant watching him. I felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph. I felt like myself. Fully, finally, without apology, without compression, without the endless internal negotiation of how much space I was allowed to take up. Revenge Chronicles will tell you that the best revenge is living well, and I used to think that was a consolation prize dressed up as wisdom. I don't think that anymore. Living well, truly well, means releasing the version of yourself that was built to survive other people's smallness. It means understanding that silence was never weakness. It was just patience waiting for the right moment to become power. And when that moment finally came for me, under string lights in a backyard that was supposed to belong to someone else's story, I was ready. I had always been ready. They just never thought to ask.